moment, just a single moment, and Nova Richardson's life changes forever. The police storm in, her colleagues' eyes filled with doubt, and the law turns its back on her. Thrown behind bars for a crime she didn't commit, Nova stands before the jury, hearing a sentence that could bury her future. But as the courtroom doors swing open, the FBI steps in with a shocking revelation. She is merely a pawn in a sophisticated scheme. Can she reclaim her honor? Or is it already too late? New York's sky loomed gray, a silent omen of misfortune. December's winter draped the city in an icy shroud, but inside the headquarters of Wells Global, the atmosphere was entirely different. Nova Richardson stood before the mirror in the 32nd floor restroom, adjusting the collar of her sleek black blazer. Her reflection stared back, sharp brown eyes, dark skin taut with tension, yet unwavering. At 32, a financial analyst, she had fought tooth and nail for this position, one of the rare black women to rise in the fiercely competitive finance industry. Born and raised in Atlanta, Nova knew hardship firsthand. Her mother, Teresa Richardson, an elementary school teacher, had sacrificed everything to give her the best education possible. She always said, "Nova, you have to work twice as hard just to get the same result. But if you persist, you will win." That mantra had been etched into Nova's soul. And now, after years of relentless effort, she stood at the heart of one of the largest financial corporations in the country. This morning, she was set to present her project on financial fraud prevention, a report she had spent the last month perfecting. A success today would mark another milestone in her career. But she had no idea that in just a few minutes, her world would come crashing down. Stepping into the conference room, Nova immediately sensed something was off. The room was full, yet whispers lingered. Eyes darted toward her with curiosity. Ethan Caldwell, the chief financial officer, greeted her with a nod, though his gaze carried an unspoken scrutiny. She opened her laptop, ready to begin. Bang! The door slammed open. Two officers stepped inside. Adam Briggs and Olivia Torres, dressed in black uniforms, holstered guns glinting under the fluorescent lights. The air in the room turned to ice. "Ms. Nova Richardson?" Briggs's voice was firm, impersonal. Nova frowned, blinking in disbelief. "Police? Here? For me? Is there a problem?" She stood, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You're under arrest for involvement in an interstate money laundering operation." The words struck like thunder. The room fell into a stunned silence. "What?" Nova's breath hitched, her pulse a wild drumbeat in her ears. All eyes turned to her. Shock, doubt, fear. Some colleagues reached for their phones, cameras already recording. There has to be some mistake. Nova tried to keep her voice even, though panic clawed at her throat. Briggs said nothing. He simply advanced, handcuffs glinting. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Nova stepped back, her mind racing. "Wait, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a financial analyst, not a criminal." Torres hesitated, flicking a glance at Briggs. But he remained unmoved. "Hands up, Richardson. Now." Nova took a slow, deep breath, heart pounding in her chest. Resistance would only make things worse. Slowly, she raised her hands, her eyes burning with defiance. Briggs stepped forward, locking the cold steel around her wrists. Click! The sound echoed like a final verdict. As Nova was led out of the conference room, the murmurs followed. "Is this real? I can't believe it. A financial analyst, involved in money laundering? Guess everyone has a dark side." She clenched her jaw, forcing back the sting of humiliation. Then, she saw him, Daniel Brooks, the one colleague she had trusted. But he wouldn't even meet her eyes. Out in the hallway, employees gathered, watching. Some lifted their phones, capturing the spectacle. Nova knew these images would flood the internet within minutes. One moment she had been a rising star in finance. The next a criminal in handcuffs. The police car waited outside. Nova was shoved into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind her. She leaned back, shutting her eyes. Was it over? No. She wouldn't be destroyed by a baseless accusation. She would fight. She had to fight. The police car sped through the bustling streets of New York. Streetlights flashed in the rearview mirror, casting flickering shadows across Nova's tense face. She sat in the back seat, wrists still cuffed, fingers clenched into tight fists. Outside, snow had begun to fall, slow, cold, relentless. Nova tried to steady her thoughts. This was a nightmare, a waking nightmare. She had never broken the law, never been involved in anything remotely illegal. So why was she here? The sharp wail of the siren cut through the air as the car turned down a narrow street. Up ahead, the precinct loomed, gray, heavy, an unyielding fortress. Briggs yanked the door open, gripping Nova's arm as he pulled her out. She didn't resist, but her eyes remained defiant. As they passed through the entrance, a white officer standing nearby muttered to his colleague, "Another one of them." Nova didn't need to ask what that meant. She clenched her teeth, but said nothing. Now was not the time to argue. The interrogation room was small, sterile, just a cold metal table and two rigid chairs. A one-way mirror covered the far wall. She knew she was being watched. Briggs took a seat across from her, fingers tapping lightly on a thick folder. Olivia Torres stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes darting away. "Ms. Richardson," Briggs began, his tone flat, almost bored. "We have sufficient evidence proving your involvement in a money laundering operation." Nova didn't flinch. "I want a lawyer," she said firmly. Briggs smirked. "Of course, but before they get here, you might want to hear the evidence against you." He opened the file and pulled out a sheet of paper. Bank records. A transaction of a large sum of money wired to an account under Nova's name from an international source flagged as suspicious. Surveillance footage. A woman bearing a strong resemblance to Nova conducting a transaction at the bank at the time of the alleged crime. Eyewitness testimony. A customer claiming to have seen Nova at the scene. Nova stared at the documents. "No, this was impossible. I never received this money. I didn't even know this account existed." Briggs leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Then how do you explain the surveillance footage?" He slid a tablet across the table. On the screen, grainy black and white footage played. A woman entered a bank, wearing sunglasses, hair pulled into a high ponytail. She approached the teller, placing a stack of documents on the counter. Her face was blurred, but at first glance, she looked exactly like Nova. Nova's breath hitched. "What the hell was this?" "That's not me," she said, voice unwavering. "Are you sure?" Nova's jaw tightened. 100%. Briggs nodded, tossing another sheet onto the table. "And what about the eyewitness? A customer who swears they saw you there." Nova shut her eyes, inhaling deeply. Someone was framing her. This wasn't just an investigation. It was psychological warfare. She tightened her fists beneath the table and lifted her gaze to Briggs. "You arrested me without seizing my personal computer, without analyzing digital evidence. And you expect me to believe you built this case on a blurry video and a single witness statement? That's laughable." For the first time, Briggs hesitated, but he recovered quickly, his expression hardening. "We have enough to prosecute." Nova narrowed her eyes. "Then why am I not in court already?" His jaw clenched. He didn't like being challenged. From the corner of the room, Torres shifted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. Nova turned to her. "Officer Torres, do you believe him?" Torres blinked, hesitating. Briggs cut in sharply. "Torres, you don't have to answer that." Torres bit her lip but stayed silent. Nova saw it, the doubt in her eyes. Something about this case wasn't right. Maybe Torres saw it too. Briggs stood abruptly, closing the file. "Ms. Richardson, I suggest you take a plea deal. Cooperate, and the court might be lenient." Nova let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "A plea deal? For a crime I didn't commit?" Briggs shrugged. "Your call. But if this goes to trial, you're looking at 10 to 15 years in prison." Nova's fists clenched. They wanted her scared. They wanted her to break. But she wouldn't. She lifted her chin, voice like steel. "I want my lawyer. Now." Briggs stared at her for a moment, then gave Torres a curt nod. "Take her to holding." Nova stood, spine straight as she walked toward the door. She knew one thing for certain. This fight was only just beginning. The steel door slammed shut behind Nova. Inside the jail cell, the air was cold, heavy with the scent of damp concrete and despair. The flickering fluorescent light cast harsh shadows against the gray walls. Nova sat down on the metal cot, tension coiling in every muscle of her body. 2 days. 2 days locked in here like a real criminal. She glanced around. The cell was small, filthy, and suffocating. A toilet was bolted to the wall, offering no semblance of privacy. The mattress was so thin she could feel the springs digging into her back. Everything in this place was designed to strip away dignity. Nova took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. From the corner of the cell, a woman watched her. White, mid-40s, her tangled hair framing a face etched with deep lines. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, the mark of too many sleepless nights. She studied Nova for a long moment before speaking. "New here?" Nova nodded, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. 2 days. The woman smirked. "Lisa Monroe. I've been here almost a year." Nova blinked. "A year?" Lisa let out a dry chuckle, leaning back against the wall. "Tax fraud. My account got hacked, but the court didn't care. I protested, but they just needed someone to blame." Nova's hands curled into fists. "Just like me." "And now?" she asked. Lisa shrugged. "Waiting for my trial. But with the pathetic public defender they assigned me, I'll probably lose." She studied Nova for a beat, then tilted her head. "So, what's your story?" Nova inhaled deeply. "Money laundering." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Did you do it?" Nova met her gaze, unwavering. "No." Lisa nodded slowly. "Then you better fight, because if you don't, this system will swallow you whole." Nova had never realized how easily a person could lose their name, their freedom, their very identity in the blink of an eye. 2 days in here, and she already felt the crushing weight of the system. The food was bland, cold, barely edible. The guards were indifferent, their eyes empty of empathy. The other inmates watched her, measuring her, as if assessing whether she was weak enough to break. But the worst part wasn't any of that. The worst part was the waiting. Waiting for a trial she wasn't sure she could win. Waiting for a decision that could rewrite the rest of her life. Lisa was right. If Nova didn't fight, she would be buried under a mountain of paperwork and false accusations. By late afternoon on the second day, a guard approached her cell and called out, "Nova Richardson, you've got bail." Nova shot to her feet. Lisa smirked. "Looks like you got lucky." Nova took a steadying breath before stepping out of the cell. She didn't know who had bailed her out, but this was the first step toward reclaiming her justice. What she didn't know was that the battle ahead would be far more brutal than she ever imagined. Nova sat in the courthouse waiting room, her heart pounding in her chest. Today, she was no longer the brilliant financial analyst. Today, she was the defendant. Outside, the hallway buzzed with anticipation. Reporters, former colleagues, strangers eager for a front-row seat to the scandal of the year. Some journalists had already drafted their headlines, "Mastermind of a financial fraud," before the trial had even begun. She adjusted the lapels of her deep blue blazer. No matter what happened today, she would not let them see her break. The door creaked open. Jordan Hayes, her attorney, stepped inside. His gaze was sharp, unwavering. A man who had been through countless battles in the courtroom and lived to fight another day. "Are you ready?" Nova swallowed hard. "Do I have a choice?" Hayes offered a small, knowing smile and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Don't let them control the narrative. I will fight for you until the end." Nova inhaled deeply. It was time to face them. As she stepped into the courtroom, every eye turned to her. She felt the weight of their stares, skepticism, scrutiny, contempt. On the opposite side of the room, Mark Lively, the notorious prosecutor known as the courtroom executioner, shuffled through his stack of papers. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, as if he had already won. The judge's gavel struck. The trial began. Lively rose, his voice commanding, practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we gather to unravel one of the most sophisticated money laundering schemes in recent history. And at the center of it all, Nova Richardson." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Nova's chest tightened. Ms. Richardson is an intelligent financial expert, someone with an intricate understanding of the banking system. And because of that knowledge, she knew exactly how to cover her tracks. But no one is above the law. He turned, eyes locking onto Nova like a predator, sizing up its prey. "We have the evidence." Then came the list. Bank accounts under Nova's name receiving illicit funds. Surveillance footage of a woman, her spitting image, conducting a suspicious transaction. Eyewitness testimony placing her at the scene. Nova's fists clenched under the table. All circumstantial, yet Lively spoke as if it were indisputable truth. "Ms. Richardson," he said coolly, "are you denying that these accounts belong to you?" Nova held his gaze. "I'm not denying the accounts exist. I'm saying I never made those transactions." Lively let out a sharp, amused breath. "Oh, then how do you explain this video?" He gestured, and the screen behind him flickered to life. Grainy black and white footage. A woman entering a bank, clad in a long coat and sunglasses. She slid a stack of papers across the counter. She looked like Nova, but it wasn't her. A flicker of uncertainty passed through the jury. Lively turned back, his expression smug. "I rest my case." Jordan Hayes rose, methodical, measured. He buttoned his suit jacket with practiced ease and stepped toward the jury. "Thank you, Mr. Lively. But let's take a closer look at this so-called evidence." He motioned for the technician to pause the video. The screen froze on the woman's feet. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution claims this is Nova Richardson. But I'd like to direct your attention to her shoes." The jury squinted at the image. This is a limited edition Prada design. Only 10 pairs were sold in all of New York City. And guess what? Hayes pulled out a document. Nova Richardson's name is nowhere on the customer list. A wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. A few jurors exchanged glances. Hayes pressed forward. "Second, the bank account transactions. Has law enforcement fully investigated them?" He turned to Lively. Silence. "I did." Hayes pulled another document from his briefcase. "And here's what I found. The IP address linked to these transactions is not from New York. It's from Europe." A ripple of shock spread through the room. For the first time, Nova felt a spark of hope. Hayes faced the judge. "Your Honor, this investigation has glaring omissions. No fingerprints on the documents. No definitive ID from the surveillance footage. And now, proof that her alleged transactions were carried out from an entirely different continent." He turned to the jury. "Does it make sense that an expert in financial crime would be this careless? That she'd make herself an obvious suspect?" The jury members shifted, doubt creeping in. Lively stood abruptly, his confident smirk fading. "The defense is making a spectacle, but we still have an eyewitness who places Ms. Richardson at the bank." Hayes didn't blink. "Then let's talk to this witness." A man was called to the stand. He fidgeted as Hayes approached. "Sir, you claim to have seen Nova Richardson in the bank that day?" The witness nodded. "Yes, I think so." "You think so?" Hayes tilted his head. "Can you describe her face in detail?" The man hesitated. "She was wearing sunglasses." Silence. Hayes turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the witness cannot confirm the defendant's identity. The surveillance footage is inconclusive. The bank accounts were accessed from overseas. Clearly, there is a third party involved in this case." Then, the doors of the courtroom swung open. A man in a crisp black suit strode inside, a thick file in his hands. FBI Special Agent Ethan Grant. He approached the judge's bench and placed the folder down. "Your Honor, I have critical evidence related to this case." A stunned hush fell over the courtroom. Nova held her breath. The real battle was about to begin. The jury returned after more than an hour of deliberation. The courtroom was deathly silent. Nova's heartbeat thundered in her chest, each pulse heavy with the weight of impending judgment. Judge Elliot Carter struck his gavel, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. Has the jury reached a verdict? A middle-aged man stood, the jury foreman. His eyes flickered briefly toward Nova before he unfolded the slip of paper in his hand. "We have not reached a unanimous decision." Nova inhaled sharply. Across the room, Mark Lively's jaw tightened. His frustration was barely concealed beneath his forced composure. Judge Carter nodded, his voice steady. "Since the jury is deadlocked, I am adjourning this trial for now and will review Attorney Jordan Hayes' request to unseal the classified documents." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Nova caught the way Lively's expression darkened. Beside her, Hayes gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, his voice calm but firm. "We still have a chance." The moment court adjourned, Mark Lively sought out Officer Olivia Torres. He leaned in, his tone laced with pressure. "I trust you know what needs to be done." Torres stiffened, but said nothing. Lively's smirk was thin, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Don't forget who gave you the opportunity to be on this case." Torres swallowed hard. She was standing at a crossroads. Stay loyal to the system or do what was right. From the corner of her eye, she saw Nova speaking with Hayes, determination etched into her face. For the first time in her career, Olivia Torres began to wonder if she had been fighting for the wrong side all along. Outside the courthouse, a swarm of reporters awaited. Microphones were thrust toward Nova, cameras flashing in rapid succession. "Ms. Richardson, how do you feel about today's ruling? Do you still claim to be innocent? Do you believe you've been set up?" Nova took a steady breath, her posture unyielding, her gaze unwavering. "I believe in justice, and I will keep fighting for the truth." Her words rang strong and defiant. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain. This battle was far from over. Inside the Manhattan District Courthouse, tension hung thick in the air. Every eye was locked on Jordan Hayes as he stood tall, his sharp gaze fixed on Judge Elliot Carter. Beside him, Nova Richardson sat still, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She knew this was the moment that could change everything. "Your Honor," Hayes began, his voice steady and commanding, "we formally request the unsealing of the investigative files in the case of Nova Richardson." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Across the room, Prosecutor Mark Lively scoffed, rising to his feet. He placed his hands firmly on the table, his voice laced with objection. "Your Honor, this request is completely unfounded." He cast a glance at the jury, trying to reinforce his argument. The prosecution has already gathered sufficient evidence to convict the defendant. Unsealing these files will only drag this case out unnecessarily. Hayes remained unfazed. He took a single step forward, eyes locked on Lively. "If you're so confident in the integrity of this investigation, why are you afraid to open the files?" A soft murmur spread through the jury box. A few jurors exchanged uncertain glances. Judge Carter rapped his gavel. "Order in the court." He turned his keen gaze to Lively. "Mr. Lively, I want a specific reason for your objection." Lively's lips pressed into a thin line. He couldn't admit what he was really hiding. After a brief hesitation, he exhaled sharply and replied, "Your Honor, these investigative files contain sensitive information that does not need to be disclosed in open court. Releasing them could compromise financial security and ongoing police procedures." Nova's hands tightened into fists. They were covering something up. Hayes seized the moment. His voice remained firm, unwavering. "If these files contain sensitive information, then that's all the more reason we need to review them. We cannot allow a defendant to be convicted based on undisclosed, unchecked evidence." The jury began whispering among themselves. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the polished wood of his desk. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of his decision filled the room. Seconds stretched. Then finally he spoke, his voice firm, decisive. "The court grants the defense's request. The investigative files will be unsealed and reviewed." Nova barely breathed. Hayes gave a slight nod. Mark Lively stiffened. He had just lost control of the game. As murmurs spread through the courtroom, Officer Olivia Torres sat toward the back, tension evident in her posture. She had watched the entire exchange. From the moment this case began, she had believed Nova was guilty. But now, too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. Lively's resistance to transparency only deepened the pit in her stomach. She stole a glance at him. His back was rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with frustration. Torres swallowed hard. If there was a flaw in this case, she was part of it. She inhaled sharply, her eyes flickering toward Nova. Had she helped put an innocent woman on trial? Hayes wasted no time flipping through the newly unsealed documents. His eyes moved quickly, scanning for anything that could shift the case. Then he stopped. a flicker of something in his expression. "Nova," he murmured, "look at this transaction record." Nova leaned in, reading the printed lines carefully. November 5th, 2:15 p.m. A cash withdrawal from a bank branch in New York. Her brow furrowed. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I was at Wells Global the entire afternoon. There's no way I could have been at that bank." A glint of satisfaction passed through Hayes' eyes. "Then we just found our first crack in the case." A stir of unease moved through the jury box. Lively's teeth ground together. Judge Carter leaned forward, his voice weighty with authority. "Mr. Hayes, are you suggesting the defendant was not at the bank when this transaction occurred?" Hayes straightened, his voice unwavering. "That is exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor. And if that's true, then the prosecution's most critical evidence against Nova Richardson," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle, "just fell apart." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time since this nightmare began, Nova felt a glimmer of hope. But just as she exhaled, the doors to the courtroom swung open. Heads turned. A tall man in a black suit strode inside, his steps deliberate, his presence commanding. A badge gleamed on his chest. "FBI." His sharp gaze swept the room before he spoke, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "I'm Special Agent Ethan Grant, FBI." He placed a thick folder onto the judge's bench. "I have evidence that could change this entire case." The tension in the courtroom became suffocating as the man in the black suit stepped inside. FBI Special Agent Ethan Grant scanned the room with sharp, assessing eyes before settling his gaze on Judge Elliot Carter. "I'm Special Agent Ethan Grant, FBI. I have evidence that could change the entire course of this case." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. At the prosecution's table, Mark Lively tensed but quickly masked his unease. He hadn't been informed of this development. "The FBI?" Judge Carter frowned. "Why is this case under federal investigation?" Grant placed a thick file on the table before him, meeting the judge's gaze. "Nova Richardson is not a suspect. She's a victim of an international identity theft operation." The courtroom erupted. Nova froze. Jordan Hayes shot to his feet, his voice sharp. "Agent Grant, please elaborate." Grant nodded and flipped open the file. A series of documents and images flashed onto the courtroom's large screen. "For over a year, we have been tracking a criminal organization specializing in identity theft and transnational money laundering. Nova Richardson is one of their victims." A surveillance image from a bank in Paris appeared on the screen. A woman in sunglasses, long curly hair, slender build. Her resemblance to Nova was uncanny. Nova inhaled sharply, her heartbeat a wild rhythm in her chest. "Who is she?" Grant's expression remained firm. "Her name is Valeria Moreau, and she is the one responsible for the transactions that led to Nova Richardson's indictment." Across the room, Mark Lively went pale but quickly recovered, masking his discomfort behind an impassive facade. "Agent Grant," he said, his voice even, "this is a state-level case, not a federal one. Our evidence clearly ties Nova Richardson to these transactions." Grant folded his arms, one brow arched. "Does it?" He tapped the file in front of him. "I have GPS data from Nova Richardson's phone at the time of the transaction. It confirms she never left her office at Wells Global." Silence fell over the room. Grant continued, his tone measured but every word hitting like a hammer. "I have IP address records from the device that conducted the transfers. The location? Europe, not New York. I have call logs from the phone used to receive OTP verification codes for these transactions. It doesn't belong to Nova Richardson. And I have evidence proving that Valeria Moreau's network has stolen the identities of dozens of individuals. Nova Richardson is just one of them." The jury began to shift, exchanging glances. Jordan Hayes watched, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes as he saw Lively's carefully constructed case begin to crumble. Judge Carter turned to Lively. "Mr. Lively, do you have a response?" Lively opened his mouth, then closed it. He had none. From the back of the room, Officer Olivia Torres had been watching. Her fingers gripped the wooden railing of the spectators section, knuckles white. From the start, she had believed Nova Richardson was guilty. She had followed orders, trusted the system. But now, Watching the evidence unfold, watching Lively's silence, she felt something shift inside her. She had been wrong. Taking a deep breath, she suddenly rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "I would like to testify." The entire room went still. Nova's breath caught in her throat. Mark Lively snapped his head toward Torres, his expression darkening. "Torres, what are you doing?" he hissed. She turned to him, her expression unwavering. "The right thing?" Stepping forward, she faced Judge Carter. "I am Officer Olivia Torres. I have been involved in this investigation from the beginning, but after hearing the FBI's findings..." She hesitated for only a moment before looking straight at Nova. "I believe Nova Richardson is innocent." Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Nova's hands trembled. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Lively shot to his feet, his voice sharp with barely contained fury. "Torres, do you realize what you're doing?" She met his glare, unshaken. "Yes, for the first time I do." Judge Carter struck his gavel. "This court will adjourn while we review the FBI's new evidence. A final ruling will be made in the next session." The jury nodded, accepting the decision. Lively collapsed into his chair, his carefully composed facade cracking. Nova exhaled, a flood of relief washing over her. She wasn't free yet, but for the first time since her arrest, she had a real shot at justice. She turned to Jordan Hayes. The veteran attorney gave her a subtle nod, his eyes filled with confidence. Nova took a deep breath. She had come so far, but she knew the fight was far from over. After the FBI presented their evidence, Mark Lively found himself cornered. On the surface, he remained composed, but deep inside, he knew his case was crumbling. He couldn't let that happen. Rising to his feet, he turned toward the jury, his voice calm, yet edged with precision. "Your Honor, I do not deny the FBI's findings. However, that does not prove that Nova Richardson is entirely innocent." Nova's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. He was still fighting? Lively pressed on. The GPS data, the IP addresses, everything the FBI presented only confirms that Nova was not physically at the bank when the transactions occurred. But it does not prove that she was unaware of the scheme, a calculated strike. He couldn't convict her outright, but he could plant doubt in the jury's mind. Perhaps Nova Richardson allowed someone else to use her credentials. Lively continued smoothly. Perhaps she knew about the operation and chose to stay silent. Nova's hands clenched into fists. "I had nothing to do with this," she burst out, but Hayes gently placed a hand on her arm, signaling her to stay calm. Jordan Hayes knew this was the moment to strike. He stood, his movements deliberate, his eyes cold and sharp as he stepped forward. "Mr. Lively," he began, his voice controlled but cutting, "let me ask you one simple question. Do you have any evidence, any at all, proving that Nova Richardson ever communicated with this criminal organization?" Lively froze. A message? A phone call? An email?" Hayes pressed, his words relentless. "Do you have a single trace of evidence linking Nova Richardson to Valeria Moreau?" Silence blanketed the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances, the air shifting. Lively's mouth tightened. Hayes took a step closer, his voice turning to steel. "You have nothing, and without evidence, all you're doing is speculating." His gaze swept the jury. And this court does not convict people based on speculation. A few jurors nodded, the weight of doubt settling in. Lively was out of moves. From the back of the courtroom, Officer Olivia Torres sat rigidly, her heart pounding. She had followed orders. She had testified against Nova. But now, she knew the truth. She had been wrong. She inhaled sharply. Then suddenly, she stood. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice slicing through the tension. "I would like to testify." The courtroom erupted in shock. Mark Lively whipped around, his eyes flashing with warning. "Torres, don't. I can't stay silent any longer." Her voice was steady as she stepped toward the witness stand. Judge Carter gave her a firm nod. "You have something to say, Officer Torres?" Torres took a deep breath. She turned toward the jury, then to Nova. "I've been part of this investigation from the beginning. I was one of the officers who carried out the arrest of Nova Richardson." She exhaled, steadying herself. "But now I have to admit, This case has serious flaws. Gasps filled the room. Mark Lively went pale. Torres squared her shoulders, her voice unwavering. I believe Nova Richardson is innocent. A ripple of disbelief spread through the gallery. Nova sat frozen, barely able to process what she had just heard. Lively shot up from his seat, his voice laced with fury. Torres, do you realize what you're doing? She turned to face him, eyes fierce and unwavering. For the first time, yes. Judge Carter slammed his gavel. This court will adjourn to review new witness testimony and FBI evidence. A final decision will be made in the next session. The jury nodded in agreement. Lively collapsed into his chair, his control slipping away. Nova let out a slow, shuddering breath. She wasn't free yet, but for the first time, she knew she was close. She turned to Jordan Hayes. The veteran attorney gave her a knowing nod, confidence burning in his gaze. Nova inhaled deeply. The fight wasn't over, but now she was sure justice was finally on her side. 8:30 a.m., Manhattan District Courthouse. A new day had begun, but the tension inside the courtroom remained as thick as a gathering storm. Everyone knew today would be the day of reckoning. Nova Richardson sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly beneath the desk. Her breaths were slow, measured, controlled. Beside her, Jordan Hayes meticulously organized his files, his piercing gaze locked on a prosecutor Mark Lively. Today, only the truth would determine Nova's fate. All rise, a court officer announced as Judge Elliot Carter entered the room. As always, his demeanor was calm, but his sharp eyes scanned every face in the courtroom. This court is now in session for the trial of Nova Richardson. Today, we will review the final pieces of evidence before the jury reaches a verdict. The entire room held its breath. Judge Carter turned to the defense table. Mr. Hayes, do you have any additional evidence to present? Hayes rose, his movements deliberate as he stepped to the center of the courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, and I believe this evidence will put an immediate end to this case. He gestured towards Special Agent Ethan Grant, who sat among the FBI representatives in the gallery. Grant stood, holding a new file in his hands. Your Honor, we now have irrefutable proof that Nova Richardson is not a criminal. She is a victim of identity theft. The jury leaned in, their focus unshaken. Grant stepped forward, presenting 3 critical pieces of evidence. First, here is a comprehensive report from the international banks involved in this alleged money laundering operation. He activated the courtroom's large screen, displaying a list of financial transactions. We have traced every suspicious transaction. The results are clear. Not a single dollar from this operation was ever deposited into Nova Richardson's accounts. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Jordan Hayes turned to the jury, his voice firm. Anyone involved in a money laundering scheme would have a financial motive. Yet Nova Richardson never received a cent. She had nothing to gain. The jury exchanged knowing glances. Grant continued. Second, we conducted forensic analysis on the financial documents from the bank where the illegal transactions occurred. He flipped open another report. The fingerprints on these documents do not belong to Nova Richardson. The courtroom erupted. We are trying to convict someone whose fingerprints aren't even on the very documents used to accuse her. Hayes emphasized. Mark Lively clenched his jaw, struggling to maintain his composure. Grant then turned toward the back of the room, where a middle-aged woman had just entered. Your Honor, I would like to call Margaret Dorsey, a bank teller from the branch where these transactions took place. Judge Carter nodded. Ms. Dorsey, are you willing to testify? Margaret Dorsey stepped hesitantly onto the witness stand, nervous but resolute. Yes, Your Honor. Hayes approached her with measured steps. Ms. Dorsey, do you recall the individual who conducted the transactions on November 5th? Dorsey's eyes flickered toward Nova before she took a deep breath. She looks very similar to the woman I saw, but I remember the voice was different. Then, locking eyes with Nova, she said the words that changed everything. I don't think it was her. Nova's mouth parted slightly, stunned. For the first time, someone who had been at the scene confirmed she was not the person who carried out the transactions. The jury members exchanged hushed whispers. Mark Lively sat frozen, his confidence visibly shaken. Judge Carter nodded, his voice thoughtful yet firm. "Thank you, Ms. Dorsey. I believe your testimony is crucial to this case." Turning to the jury, he asked the question that would decide everything. "Does the jury have enough information to reach a verdict?" The jury foreman stood. "Your Honor, we are ready to deliver our verdict." Mark Lively clenched the stack of documents on his desk, his eyes sweeping over each juror. He knew the odds were against him, but he couldn't let this case slip away. Not like this. "Your Honor," he said, his voice measured, "I request permission to make a final argument." Judge Carter gave a firm nod, though his gaze was sharper than ever. "Proceed, but keep it brief, Mr. Lively." Lively inhaled deeply, forcing himself to maintain composure, then stepped into the center of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we cannot ignore the fact that Nova Richardson's identity was used in this crime." Nova narrowed her eyes. He was still trying to hold on? "The FBI's evidence may prove that the fingerprints on the documents do not match the defendant. But let's ask ourselves, why was Nova Richardson's name used? Why were these bank accounts opened in her name?" The jury remained silent. Nova felt frustration simmering beneath her skin, but Jordan Hayes sat as still as stone. Lively pressed forward. "We cannot rule out the possibility that the defendant was aware of this operation, but chose to remain silent. Perhaps she didn't execute the transactions herself, but that doesn't mean she wasn't complicit. And if that's the case, Nova Richardson is still responsible." He exhaled, as if convincing himself of his own argument. On the outside, he appeared composed, but inside, he knew this was a desperate gamble. Hayes didn't wait. He rose immediately, his movements steady and controlled as he stepped forward, his presence commanding. "I object to the prosecution's argument, Your Honor." Judge Carter nodded. "Mr. Hayes, you may proceed." Hayes turned, first to Lively, then to the jury. "Mr. Lively has presented a theory that Nova Richardson may have known about this money laundering scheme and stayed silent." He paused, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "But the law does not convict based on maybes." His words rang through the courtroom. "There are no messages from Nova to these criminals. There are no documents bearing her signature. There are no recorded calls linking her to the perpetrators of this crime." Hayes turned fully toward the jury, his voice unwavering. "We do not imprison innocent people over speculation. A conviction requires proof. Proof the prosecution simply does not have." A slow wave of nods spread through the jury box. Mark Lively's face drained of color. Just when it seemed the trial had reached its climax, Olivia Torres suddenly rose from her seat. "Your Honor, I have something to say." All heads turned. Mark Lively went rigid. "Torres, what are you doing?" His voice was low, laced with warning. She met his glare head-on, then took a deep breath. "I have stayed silent for too long." She turned toward the jury. "I was part of this investigation from the very beginning, and I have to admit, there was pressure from higher-ups to close this case as quickly as possible." A shockwave rippled through the courtroom. Mark Lively's mouth fell open, speechless. Pressure from whom? Judge Carter's voice had dropped, heavy with something dangerous. Torres hesitated for only a second, then looked straight at Lively. The district attorney's office. The courtroom erupted. Jurors exchanged hushed but urgent whispers. Nova's heart pounded in her chest. Mark Lively hadn't just prosecuted the wrong person. He had done so knowingly. And now, in front of everyone, he had been exposed. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Nova Richardson sat motionless at the defense table, her fingers unconsciously intertwined, gripping tightly. Beside her, Jordan Hayes flipped through his documents with quiet precision, his gaze steady, unreadable. Though he said nothing, Nova knew. He had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Across the room, Mark Lively looked more exhausted than ever. He sat upright, but his hands, resting on the desk, had begun to tremble. "All rise." The court officer's voice rang out as Judge Elliot Carter entered. He lowered himself into his seat with slow deliberation, his sharp eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on the jury foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A middle-aged man rose, holding a slip of paper. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The room fell utterly silent. Nova felt her breath slow, her heartbeat pounding so fiercely she feared it might shatter. Judge Carter gave a small nod. "You may proceed." The foreman glanced at the paper, inhaling deeply before announcing. "After reviewing all evidence and testimonies, we, the jury, find the defendant, Nova Richardson." A pause. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Nova closed her eyes as a surge of heat rushed through her chest. She was free. The gavel struck down. This court officially dismisses all charges against Nova Richardson. She is to be released immediately. Nova exhaled, slowly, as though an unbearable weight had just been lifted from her shoulders. She turned to Jordan Hayes. He met her gaze with a firm nod, his expression warm, but not surprised. He had believed in this outcome from the very beginning. Across the room, Mark Lively sat frozen. Everything he had clung to, everything he had fought to control, reduced to dust in an instant. His career, his reputation, his power, all destroyed by his own arrogance. But Judge Carter wasn't finished. Turning to Lively, his expression hardened. "Mr. Lively, given Officer Torres' testimony and the irregularities in this case, I am ordering an internal review of the district attorney's office and your handling of this prosecution." A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Lively's jaw clenched, his fists tightening beneath the table. He knew he had lost, not just this trial, but everything. He turned his gaze to Nova, and for the first time, there was no disdain, no cold indifference. Only bitterness. Outside the courthouse, the crisp winter air brushed against Nova's face. But for the first time in weeks, she felt light. She was truly free. The moment she stepped out, a swarm of reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras aimed at her. "Ms. Richardson, how do you feel now that your name has been cleared? Do you plan to sue the district attorney's office? What do you have to say to those who doubted you?" Nova inhaled deeply, squaring her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. "I only hope that no one else will have to endure what I have." Just one sentence. And for a brief moment, the crowd fell silent. Then, the questions resumed, but Nova had already turned away, stepping forward into the streets of New York. She was no longer the accused. She was someone reborn. 3 days later, Brooklyn. Nova sat in a quiet cafe, watching the steady flow of people outside, their lives moving forward uninterrupted. Across from her, Jordan Hayes stirred his tea, his eyes studying her carefully. "So, what's next?" he asked, his voice as calm as ever. Nova rested her elbow on the table, considering for a moment before smiling. "I'm going to help people like me. People who have been wrongfully accused, who have no one to fight for them. I can't let this system keep crushing the innocent." Hayes nodded, a flicker of something like pride in his eyes. "Good," he said. "I look forward to seeing that." Nova took a deep breath. She had lost everything, but she had found something greater. A new purpose, a new path, the path to justice. 1 month after her acquittal, Nova Richardson still hadn't adjusted to her new life. She was no longer imprisoned, no longer standing trial, no longer subjected to the relentless accusations of the prosecution. But she also couldn't return to her old life. Wells Global had quietly erased her. The calls from former colleagues dwindled, then disappeared entirely. She had become a name people avoided, an uncomfortable reminder of a system that had failed. The same media that had once branded her the financial criminal had long since moved on to another scandal. She was innocent, but the system had left its scars. Nova's case didn't fade into obscurity. It sent shockwaves through the justice system. Pushpin, the NYPD, launched an internal investigation. Officers involved in her arrest, particularly Adam Briggs, were subjected to a full review of their past cases. Pushpin's suspect identification procedures were reformed. The reliance on blurry surveillance images and unreliable eyewitnesses was called into serious question. Pushpin prosecutor Mark Lively was suspended, pending an investigation by the federal prosecutor's office. Nova hadn't just reclaimed her freedom. She had forced the system to change. But for her, it wasn't enough. She couldn't just walk away. Nova began working with organizations advocating for the wrongfully accused. She met others like herself, people crushed by the gears of a flawed justice system. She listened to their stories. A man who had spent 10 years behind bars for a crime with no clear evidence. A woman coerced into confessing to a crime she never committed. They never had a lawyer like Jordan Hayes. They never had the FBI stepping in at the last moment to tip the scales. Nova clenched her fists. She had to do something. The same newspapers that had once smeared her name now wanted an exclusive. They wanted to know how she felt after the trial. They wanted to know if she planned to sue the NYPD. Nova's response was brief. I won't waste my time on those who got it wrong. I want to focus on helping those who, like me, were wrongly accused. The interview went viral. In an instant, she transformed from a victim into a voice for justice. And then a particular email arrived. Nova opened her inbox, skimming through the subject line. Speaking invitation from Harvard Law School. She froze. Harvard? She read on. We have been deeply moved by your fight for justice. We believe our law students can learn a great deal from your story. We would be honored to invite you to speak at our upcoming seminar on judicial reform next week. Nova sat still, staring at the words. They wanted to hear her story? She took a slow, steady breath. Then she typed a reply. I accept. That day, Nova Richardson stepped onto the stage at Harvard Law School. Before her sat hundreds of law students, professors, and legal experts, the future lawyers, judges, and prosecutors of the world. One day, one of them might be the person deciding someone's fate. She took a deep breath, then began. 3 months ago, I stood in a courtroom, not as a speaker, but as a defendant, waiting for others to decide my fate. The room fell into absolute silence. I was arrested in my office, handcuffed in front of my colleagues. I was called a criminal. I was locked in a cold jail cell, surrounded by people who looked at me as if I had done something unforgivable. But I was innocent, so why was I still behind bars? Nova's gaze swept across the hall, her voice steady, unwavering. Because I was just another number in the system. And this system makes more mistakes than we like to believe. She paused for a moment, letting her words settle before continuing. We like to think that the law is just, but what happens when those who enforce it get it wrong? She turned to the front row, where Harvard's top legal mind sat, listening intently. A misidentification can steal a person's freedom. A coerced confession can send an innocent person to prison. An ambitious prosecutor can destroy a life, just to win. I was nearly crushed by this system, but I fought back, and I won. She looked out at the faces before her, her voice rising with conviction. But I cannot be the only one who wins. This system only changes when people are willing to stand up and say, we can do better. People like you, one day, you will stand in a courtroom. And when that day comes, I hope you remember me. Remember that there was once a woman named Nova Richardson who was wrongly accused. And remember that justice is not just a concept in a textbook. It is something we must fight to protect. The room erupted into applause. As the speech ended, Nova stepped outside, inhaling the crisp Cambridge air. Beside her, Jordan Hayes gave a rare smile. That was an incredible speech. Nova shrugged, but her eyes burned with determination. I just told the truth. He nodded, studying her for a long moment. So, what's next? Nova turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the sky stretched endlessly ahead. I'll keep fighting. I'll protect justice. And I will never stop. Nova Richardson's story was more than just a wrongful conviction. It was a reflection of a deeper truth, that the justice system makes mistakes, that the most vulnerable often suffer the most. In today's world, we must be vigilant. We must resist the urge to judge too quickly. Justice is not just the responsibility of the courts. It is the responsibility of all of us. If you see injustice, do not look away. Speak up. Seek the truth. Help those who need it. Change begins when someone is brave enough to stand up for what is right. Nova's journey doesn't end here. Has justice truly prevailed? Or are there still hidden forces manipulating everything behind the scenes? Leave a comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for more shocking cases.